Thanks a lot, Omar. Can we ask Cathrine to come up here as well? I think we just move this over there.
Ah, okay. I feel I should have a glass of wine.
Thanks a lot for two excellent presentations that really took us from the code of ethics that you presented, that I think is excellent, but we need to discuss more, and then really questioning both development, our role as academics in it all, but the whole notion of solidarity. We've had some questions coming in, but I'd also like to allow if there is anyone in the audience that like to put their hands up, please do that. I think, Synnove, do you have some other questions that you'd like to start with?
Yes,
for the
I
panelists?
can start with one of the questions here. So, an anonymous writer is asking, in a situation on unequal relations, what keeps ethics of care from being reduced to paternalism, which in turn reduces people to beneficiaries and not agents? So because of the unequal, how I understand it, because there's an unequal relationship as the context of the situation, how is it possible to avoid that ethics of care becomes paternalistic and then reducing people to be beneficiaries of care?
I think what the potential, maybe I'm not able to answer fully that question in a short space, but I think what is really exciting and productive with ethics of care is that it actually problematizes that relationship, and it opens up for ways that humanitarians could problematize and be more attentive to that relationship in their day-to-day work. It doesn't necessarily solve everything, but hopefully by having that as a tool, it is possible as well to enter into that unequal relation in a different way. So I think that's my starting point, really.
One question which has gotten 2 votes, so more interested in that, is about the language, how we're using the language. So the language we use is important in humanizing others. Why do we use dichotomous language which lumps diverse groups together, such as the global North and South?
Good question. Why do we? We shouldn't be. But I mean, yesterday there was presentations around the group and how the ways in which groups form, and I suppose that we are members of multiple groups ourselves, and we position ourselves as collectives in different ways that are temporal and spatial and change over time. But the problem within development is that there's this sort of external mapping between sort of colonized and colonizer. I'm not very keen on the terms global North and global South. I've always preferred, I'm sort of on a one-woman mission to keep first world and third world, because I think it reinvigorates the politics that's embedded in that relationship, even though it's another dualism. So yes, I think that language is very problematic, and that I don't think that we don't actually need to use it. We don't need to use that language, and we've got a lot of debate in the refugee literature, in newspapers now. Al Jazeera and the BBC always have a footnote at the bottom saying what we mean by refugees is, or they actually just use a longer term, somebody who has left Syria because of this. And so, yeah, I think that we need to unpack that language, because embedded in it is those unequal power relations.
Yeah. Do you want to add something, Cathrine?
No, I agree.
You also feel free to, raise your hands. We have mics.
Can you start by introducing yourself, please? It works.
Yeah, all right. Raymond Sana from the Center for Socioeconomic Development in Geneva. I'd like to thank both presenters for very moving, thoughtful, and future-pacing presentations. Future pacing, I'd like to hear from the two of you, what are your expectations and maybe also concerns about the 2 global compacts that are being negotiated? As you know, one on refugees by the United Nations member countries, one on refugees and the other one on migrants. How much would that impact both fields, development and humanitarianism? Thanks.
I mean, I'll just very quickly, I'm sure you've got more to say about that, but just very quickly for me is that I think that it's, you know, it's important that we have some kind of collective action, and that's what I feel solidarity is about. I don't know whether they necessarily emerge out of policy and compacts. But for me, one of the issues that I'm really keen for us to look at in more detail is not necessarily just refugees, but the notion of refugee-ness. And I think that's absent in a lot of those debates, is the ways in which refugee-ness has become a discursive and highly politicized term that brings together all kinds of issues that in themselves are problematic. So what I would suggest is that, you know, talking about compacts around refugees and migrants, that we need to think much more carefully about migrancy and refugee-ness and what they mean, and I think that will help us move forward.
No, I would just like to add to that. I think one of the challenges is that a lot of it is taking place within the same discourse as before. And as we have seen very clearly, the normative frameworks and the durable solutions are not very much reachable for a number of the people that the global compacts are discussing. And it's very difficult to connect the two in the current language that's being used and in the current sort of vocabulary that's being developed. So there is something that we need to speculate a bit outside that in a way, I think, in order to think what can be done. So I very much agree.
There's one over there, please.
Thank you. I really enjoyed both of those talks. My question concerns the sort of, with development studies re-engaging with post-colonial studies. Do we need to think, I'd like to hear your thoughts on the idea that we need to introduce into our lexicon the term reparations, and whether that might be helpful.
That's a very good question. I don't know whether I'm sorry, I'm not quite sure whether I can sort of gather my thoughts enough to respond very directly to that. But there's a wonderful novel which is called The Apologist by Jay Rayner. And he's so good at apologizing to past partners that he's done horrible things to, and things that he's stolen from his mum's handbag, etc. And he becomes such an expert apologist that he becomes the chief apologist for the UN Organization of Apology. And it's an amazing story because he travels around the world cooking, gumbo in the southern states of America to apologize for slavery, or going somewhere else today. And it's very interesting because it plays on that issue around reparation and apology. And what the UN Organization for Apology found out in the end is that if you say sorry, then you will have to pay less reparations than if you don't say sorry. And sorry, that's a really awful response. But I was just thinking about that book the other day, because as I was thinking about solidarity. So I'm really sorry, really glib response to a very, very important question.
I can't match that. But I think one common aspect of the two talks is really about the importance to bring in biography. I mean, what humanitarianism is often about is saving biological lives, and the biography is very often forgotten. And people are not being seen as, subjects because of that in many situations. We've seen it with the ways that these massive frameworks to map vulnerability is taking place in Jordan, for example, today. And I think this is actually, collecting so much information about refugees without including their histories is really very problematic. So bringing in the past and history, as you say, at all levels and all scales is crucial in the discussion that we are having. So, sorry, that wasn't so fun, but...
Much more intellectual.
I wonder if I should bring it more in then the practical direction as well, if I can, because we've been working on different refugee crises. What we see now, like Syria, we see continuous effort in Afghanistan, we see Yemen, we see all these countries now producing migrants for different reasons that somehow then, and partly causing the debate and the picture that you point out, is that they have come to Europe. A lot of these states are now labeled as one term, fragile states. And our response is then often to provide more development assistance, less attention actually on the humanitarian side, because it's seen as developing these states, building their own capacity to handle the crisis, and ensuring development is then implicitly what will reduce terrorism and less migration. So I have a lot of concern with this term as being adapted because one, I don't think one size fits all. They are so diverse. There are so diverse reasons why people are leaving these countries. So how are we as academics to address this term, fragile states? How are we going to address and discuss development possibilities? How are we going to discuss how we, together with, or whatever term we use, with people in those areas define the humanitarian needs? Can you see a way where we somehow can take this challenge, which is really where academia meets politics at the moment?
I mean, I feel that one of the things that I've really noticed in the media is that we have a lot of the representations like the ones that I showed, but there's very little discussion now about why people are moving. And if you read the media, all you see is overcrowded boats and languages of swarming and, you know, kind of like waves of migrants coming and instilling that fear. We don't really have very detailed or even just brief summaries of what the context is. And I think that's very much missing. And I think in our teaching and in our writing, we need to explain historically and politically and socially why it is that people are moving. They are not producing migrants and refugees. Nobody is producing a migrant and a refugee. People are creating contexts which are historically embedded, whereby certain groups of people need to leave because they're fleeing persecution. And I think that that's really important. I think the second thing, and I'm sure Cathrine will be able to say much more about that given your research, is that, you know, most migrants are not coming to Europe. I mean, most of them are going to the 4 countries surrounding Syria. So there's also that kind of representation where it appears as though that they're all wanting to come to Europe. And actually, a lot of, and you can say more about this, but want to return to Syria or their place of origin.
Yeah, I think one of my really, it's a term that I get very provoked by is a lot of the policy language says refugees who find themselves in a particular situation. I mean, they don't find themselves in that situation. There is a way that, you know, they came into that situation. They have showed an enormous amount of mobilization of their own resources and agency to be able to be there. But there is that particular trajectory which they have had to take to be able to get there. And there's very little understanding of that. And this conflation about refugees or migrants, etc., that we see in the public media is really contributing to that. And the issue of fragile state is, of course, a way of, you know, making this even more simplified, I think. So I really agree. And it is challenging, though. And I think this is really, you know, what do we do as researchers? How do we convey that message? I mean, migration researchers within development has been jumping up and down for I don't know how many years, saying that you can't just stop migration, right? But still, that is very much of the discourse that is out there. So I don't know. I think this is really, and there are some sessions here about how do we, you know, portray, how do we become part of the discourse, and how can we change it as researchers? And I think much more can be done, of course.
And one question which has been sent in from the audience, which relates to the answer that you have given, is the question of what about the role of development education in cultivating solidarity? Has that been undervalued by the development sector? And I'd like to add a question myself on that, and that is, I sometimes find it hard to write about solidarity, to make the distinction as an analytical notion and using then, I'm an anthropologist, using my empirical data. So, because in some cases you do see practices which are they are presented as solidaric by the people who are performing them, but if you analyze them through an analytical notion of solidarity, you might then question, is this solidarity or is it not? So how do you go about making that distinction analytically and in practice?
And can I add a small thing? Because I started my humanitarian work in a solidarity movement. How can you avoid being so focused on solidarity with one group or one country or situation that you somehow lose some of the critical reflection that is required for all the times for solidarity to move on?
Well, I mean, solidarity is not a position, is it? I mean, it's an attribute, it's an aptitude, it's the way in which you understand the world and you see other people. So you're not locked into a solidaristic position where you're then excluding other groups. And of course, we're differently solidaristic in different moments, and Lily Chuluaki says, well, you know, a lot of what we learn about, what we see, invokes all kinds of different affects, forms of affect that you talked about, and where the solidarity comes is where you feel something but you act on the basis of that, and it's not just the feeling, and that's not enough. You know, that's the empathy and the sympathy, which is hugely problematic for all kinds of reasons that I think we've tried to show this morning. But it's about acting on that and doing something. And, you know, to go back to Hannah Arendt and Roger Silverstone, both of them, so Roger Silverstone talks about existential responsibility and Hannah Arendt talks about the doer and the sufferer as interchangeable. And I think that's what we haven't quite understood, is that actually we are all on the move in different ways. And so I think we're having the wrong conversation. I don't know why we're talking about refugees and migrants. I mean, why have we constituted this group? But there's groups of people who, for various reasons, are in a really horrendous, traumatic situation. And we've just got completely waylaid by, you know, what do we mean by refugee? What do we mean by migrant? I just think it's completely the wrong conversation.
I think thinking about how you would separate it analytically, it's also about, for the work that I've done with humanitarian workers and the interviews that we've done with humanitarian workers, I mean, humanitarian workers are just normal people, and it's a lot of professionalization. I mean, they're doing a job, and I think you need to separate what is the ideology of a particular organization, but also the individual motivations. And that's where I think it is very fascinating and very important to focus on what individual humanitarian workers do in a particular situation. Also because these humanitarian workers very often move from one side to another. This knowledge and the particular ways that people work is coming with them. We saw it very, very prominently, particularly in the beginning, in the Middle East crisis, when we interviewed people who had just worked in rural South Sudan, and suddenly they were dealing with Syrian refugees in urban Amman. And they brought the same issues with them and had to negotiate themselves. So there's a lot of that sort of practical work that takes place in a particular situation that is part of shaping what humanitarian practice is. And with that comes particular forms of solidarity and particular forms of interaction with the different groups of people that they engage with. So I think you need to separate somehow in that sense.
But then in a sense you are saying that some of the humanitarians are getting so professional that they forget actually to interact with those that they should together find a solution for. Any further questions? We have one, please.
No. There.
There's one there as well.
Ah, okay.
Oh.
That's all right. I didn't see.
I'm Kathy Sutherland from Development Studies at University of KwaZulu-Natal in South Africa. And I was just thinking about the plenary yesterday where one of the speakers spoke about the disappointment of South Africa. And that's ringing quite strongly in my mind when I see this presentation, because in a way, in a country like South Africa, these processes that you're talking about are actually happening within the spaces of transformation in our country. And part of what I'm reflecting on in the way that you're speaking here is there's still a distance between the other. So it's another country, it's refugees coming from somewhere. But the processes that you're talking about, I'm thinking of the informal settlements we work in. These processes are happening in the everyday lived worlds of South Africa every single day. And in fact, the ways that people are negotiating, changing identities, working together, are kind of addressing a lot of the things that you're talking about. So I suppose I mostly wanted to challenge that idea yesterday of the disappointment of South Africa, and in fact ask people to look at the local spaces in South Africa and look at these engagements and the movement of people and how people on the ground are addressing that in multiple forms. And that maybe some of the answers, and I don't like the north-south divide either, but maybe some of the answers of trying to address these challenges in the so-called north are actually already sitting in the south, because that's what we work on every day. So it's certainly not a disappointment of South Africa, but a lot of very good change that's happening around the kinds of issues you're talking about. So maybe it's about an issue of scale, and maybe it's about distance and how we actually still see the other. Because in our society, the other is right next door to us. It's not that far away.
Thank you. I think we have one, that will be the final one. Oh, we have one more. So the two finalists, the gentleman at the back, and then you up here, please.
Yep, thanks. Asbjørn Løberg is the name. I would like to go back to Cathrine's dichotomy in the beginning, humanitarianism 1.0, and then you had 2.0, 2.1. You sort of hinted that there is more to come. So is there a humanitarianism 3.0 as well? And to challenge you, I would say I would reject it. I would say that humanitarianism 2.0 is really humanitarianism 101, if you like. That should be the basis. Because if you want to have any impact on policy and on public opinion in Western countries, I think it's necessary to be a bit conservative, go back to the human rights, and legitimize your concerns in relationship to the fundamental principles of human rights, including anti-discrimination clauses. And it's only if you do that that you can get into a sensible discussion about what does it cost to help everybody. Because you can't help everybody immediately everywhere in the world. Now, the human rights discourse means that once you get into the literature on economic, social, and cultural rights, you will immediately be confronted with very rich literature on what does it cost to realize the different economic and social rights. And that's necessary if you want to go beyond just making moral statements on humanitarianism. Second point to Uma, this colonialism, apologize for the colonial past. It troubles me quite a bit because if it is not only an intellectual position, but also a position taken by governments, including the Indian one, you would have a number of governments around the world, more or less, not the most democratic ones, but authoritarian or autocratic regimes, who would stand up and applaud. Yes, everything that's wrong in our society is due to the colonial powers 50, 60, 70 years ago when we got our independence. So it doesn't make sense to pursue that one. But there is a clear distinction between the demand to say sorry to minorities within countries. And that's a different issue. And it should be pursued as a very different issues. And that's legitimate. I mean, you had it with indigenous peoples in many parts of the world. The demand that the state has to say, I'm sorry for the human rights abuses within our own country. But that's a different issue from this stupid apologize for colonialism, colonialism that ended 60, 70 years ago.
Thank you, Asbjørn. Very strong and critical questions to the two. But I wonder if we can take the last question as well, so then you can round up with all of it. Please.
Emma Maudsley from the University of Cambridge. Thank you for two incredibly inspirational talks. So it was really a comment partly responding to Kathy's observation, but also thinking about solidarities, about different geographies. And I was thinking that the Daily Mail's other great target, it's probably second to immigrants, is chavs and benefit scroungers and the poor. And I was thinking about those others in our own societies, like South Africa, and the way in which the Daily Mail seeks to dehumanize them, seeks to other them. And they're also the populations who very often bear the most immediate sort of effect of migrants and refugees being resettled in the very small numbers that Britain has shamefully taken. So, you know, there's a fascinating set of, I think, possibilities as well, and different solidarities generated by those dehumanized others in very different spaces and coming together and bringing, you know, getting away from that nasty north-south developmentalism and seeing, you know, different geographies of both othering and solidarity.
Thank you.
Can I just respond very quickly, because mine's going to be short. I wasn't suggesting at all about the apology. I mean, that was sort of, you know, it was a trite kind of response to a very wonderful question about reparations. So I wasn't suggesting that. What I was suggesting was that we can't just be future orientated, which is what we do in development, about goals and targets and sort of, you know, mid-year reports and all those kinds of things, that we need to look at past injustices to understand the ways in which people's agency is constituted and the context in which it takes place. So I wasn't suggesting that. And Emma, yes, thanks very much for that. I mean, what I didn't really get time to say very much about, but which I wanted to, and it relates to the comment about South Africa, is that you know, we've tried in the UK for years and years to sort of legislate for multiculturalism, to introduce policies. And of course, you don't build solidarity in that way, as both of you have said, the example from South Africa and Emma, your comment, that this happens at the level of convivial culture. This is in the everyday and the mundane rhythms of our lives. And so you can't legislate for that. And I was thinking about the humanitarian, in the humanitarian context, is that the people who are the first on the scene is your neighbor. You know, it's only later that the professional appears, and as you say, then pushes out the local. And it's there that there's a different kind of solidarity and a conviviality that's taking place. But I think we don't see it because it only becomes a humanitarian event, and it only becomes humanitarianism when a particular body of groups of people arrive and do particular kinds of things.
And if I can add a small thing, it's often women who are first on the scene, but they are never seen or have contributed to any humanitarian disasters at all. Cathrine.
Right, so the humanitarianism 1.1 or 2.0, I think for me, I called it 2.0 because there is a distinction, I think, between humanitarianism with and without a sort of rights-based approach. And that's very important in the ethics behind the humanitarian principles. When you bring in rights, you bring in a kind of accountable governments, you know, so you become much more involved in something that's slightly different from the original humanitarian principles, but today is very much part of the humanitarian discourse, I would say. Then I agree with you. I mean, I don't think a lot will change. I think 2.1 is very much to say that it's not like this is going to revolutionize the way that humanitarianism works. But even though I'm very critical to this sort of language of localization, and I really think, I don't know why did they call it the grand bargain? I think it's a terrible concept. But in the way, that language of localization, participation, it opens up something that I think by bringing in ethics of care is possible to move on in a particular direction. So it's a kind of opening, in a way, towards a perhaps more approach that could have more different types of humanitarianisms open in the discourse. And then I think an additional thing there is that I'm talking about the particular humanitarian space, as I call it, these different in-between humanitarian spaces, between rights and humanity in a way, in this particular case of protracted displacement. I think in other cases, rights might be much more important, for example, but we need to find a way of negotiating what is happening when people are stuck for an average of 26 years and how we deal with that and focus on that. So I think it's important that we differentiate between many different situations where the principles and the tools need to be used in different ways.
Thanks a lot, Cathrine. I'm afraid we have to close. No, I think we have identified a number of pressing issues that we as academics and others who are going to take our advice really need to address. A big, big thanks to the two of you. A lot of thanks for the audience for the good questions and to Synnove.
And to Arne.